Parents' excuses, rejected after neglecting child. Judge Caprio's strong words, shock courtroom. The November morning mist clung to the windows of Providence Municipal Court like a shroud of sorrow, as if nature itself sensed the gravity of the case that would unfold within these sacred walls of justice. Inside courtroom 2A, Judge Frank Caprio sat at his bench, reviewing a file that had kept him awake much of the previous night. In his 43 years of serving the people of Rhode Island, few cases had stirred his compassionate heart as deeply as the one before him today. The case file bore the name State of Rhode Island vs. Derek Mitchell, a seemingly routine matter involving unpaid truancy fines that had escalated into something far more troubling. What had begun as a simple administrative issue had revealed a pattern of child neglect so profound that it challenged even Judge Caprio's legendary faith in human redemption. Yet, as always, the beloved judge approached the case with the perfect balance of legal wisdom and genuine compassion that had made him a beacon of hope throughout New England. 8-year-old Emma Mitchell had been absent from Cranston Elementary School for 47 days during the previous semester, not due to illness or family emergency, but because her father, Derek, had simply stopped ensuring she attended. When truancy officers visited the family's modest apartment on Broad Street, they discovered conditions that painted a heartbreaking picture of a child whose basic needs were being systematically ignored by the person responsible for her care and protection. Emma's story had come to light through the dedicated work of Mrs. Patricia Santos, a veteran school social worker whose 30 years of experience had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of neglect that others might overlook. Mrs. Santos had noticed that Emma, once a bright and engaged student, had become increasingly withdrawn during her sporadic appearances at school. The little girl would arrive wearing the same clothes for days at a time, often unwashed, and sometimes bearing stains that suggested she was preparing her own meals. Her hair, once neatly braided by her late mother, hung in tangles that spoke of weeks without proper care. But it was Emma's behavior that most concerned Mrs. Santos. The child had begun hoarding food from the school cafeteria, stuffing rolls and fruit into her backpack with the desperate efficiency of someone who didn't know when her next meal would come. During recess, while other children played, Emma would sit alone, her small frame hunched with a weariness that no 8-year-old should ever carry. When teachers tried to engage her, she would respond with a hollow politeness that masked a profound sadness, the learned behavior of a child who had discovered that expressing her needs only led to disappointment. Mrs. Santos's investigation revealed that Emma's neglect had begun gradually following the death of her mother, Linda Mitchell, from cancer 18 months earlier. Linda had been the anchor of their small family, a devoted mother who had worked as a nurse at Rhode Island Hospital while battling her own illness with remarkable courage. Her final months had been spent not in self-pity, but in carefully arranging every detail of Emma's future care, believing that her husband Derek would honor her memory by providing their daughter with the love and stability she deserved. Derek Mitchell presented a complex figure that defied simple categorization. At 34, he possessed the physical appearance of responsibility, well-groomed, articulate, and capable of projecting sincerity when the situation demanded it. He held a steady job as a maintenance supervisor at a downtown office complex, earning enough to provide adequately for his daughter's material needs. To casual observers, he might have appeared to be a hard-working single father doing his best under difficult circumstances. However, Derek's relationship with fatherhood had always been complicated, even before his wife's death. During Linda's illness, he had increasingly retreated into himself, finding solace in online gaming communities where he could escape the overwhelming reality of his wife's deteriorating condition and the demands of caring for a young child. What had begun as a coping mechanism had gradually evolved into an addiction that consumed increasing amounts of his time and emotional energy. After Linda's death, Derek's escapism intensified rather than resolved. The apartment that had once been filled with a mother's loving attention became a monument to neglect. Dishes accumulated in the sink until they attracted insects. Laundry piled up until Emma was forced to wear dirty clothes to school. The refrigerator, once stocked with healthy meals prepared by Linda, contained little more than energy drinks, takeout containers, and whatever processed food Derek remembered to purchase during his infrequent grocery runs. More devastating than the physical neglect was Derek's emotional withdrawal from his daughter. Emma's natural childhood needs for attention, affection, and guidance were increasingly met with irritation or complete indifference. When she tried to show him schoolwork or share stories from her day, Derek would grunt acknowledgements without looking away from his computer screen. When she asked for help with homework, he would tell her to figure it out yourself, or promise to help later, a later that never came. The truancy that brought the case to Judge Caprio's attention was merely the most visible symptom of this broader pattern of neglect. Emma had begun missing school not because Derek actively prevented her from attending, but because he had stopped fulfilling the basic parental responsibilities of ensuring she woke up on time, had clean clothes to wear, and understood the importance of her education. On many mornings, Derek would sleep until noon after gaming sessions that lasted until 3 or 4 a.m., leaving Emma to fend for herself in an adult world she was too young to navigate alone. The little girl had tried, with heartbreaking determination, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She had attempted to wake herself up for school using an old alarm clock, but at 8 years old, she lacked the executive functioning skills to manage her morning routine independently. She had tried to prepare her own meals, but had access only to whatever processed foods were available, and no knowledge of proper nutrition or food safety. Most tragically, she had tried to be good by not bothering her father with requests for help, believing that his neglect was somehow her fault. A common psychological response among children who are forced to adapt to inadequate care. The breaking point had come on a cold October morning when Mrs. Santos received a call from a neighbor reporting that Emma had been seen walking to school alone at 6:30 a.m., wearing only a thin sweater and carrying a grocery bag containing what appeared to be her belongings. When Mrs. Santos arrived at Emma's apartment to investigate, she found Derek still asleep, unaware that his daughter had left the house or that she hadn't been attending school regularly for weeks. The subsequent investigation by Rhode Island's Department of Children, Youth and Families painted a devastating picture of systematic neglect. Emma's medical records showed missed appointments for routine checkups and vaccinations. Her dental health had deteriorated due to lack of supervision regarding oral hygiene. Her academic performance, once excellent, had declined dramatically as her school attendance became sporadic and her home life provided no support for learning. Perhaps most heartbreaking was Emma's own testimony during the DCYF investigation. When asked about her daily routine, she described mornings spent trying to wake up her father, afternoons spent alone while he worked, and evenings spent in silence while he played online games. When asked about her feelings, she expressed not anger or resentment, but worry, concern that she was somehow failing to be a good enough daughter to earn her father's attention and care. The social workers assigned to the case were veteran professionals who had seen countless instances of child neglect, but Emma's situation affected them deeply. Here was a child who possessed intelligence, resilience, and a capacity for love that her circumstances had not been able to destroy. She spoke of her mother with reverence, recounting bedtime stories and family traditions with the precision of someone desperately trying to preserve precious memories. She expressed hope that things would improve, that her father would get better, and that they could be a real family again. Judge Caprio had reviewed Emma's file with the thoroughness that characterized his approach to every case, but also with the special attention he reserved for matters involving children. His own grandchildren were close to Emma's age, and he could not read her story without imagining his own precious grandchildren in similar circumstances. The thought of any child experiencing such neglect stirred emotions that went far beyond his professional obligations as a judge. The legal aspects of the case were relatively straightforward. Derek had violated Rhode Island's compulsory education laws, failed to meet his basic parental responsibilities, and created conditions that constituted neglect under state family law. But Judge Caprio understood that effective justice in cases involving children required more than simple legal remedies. It required wisdom, compassion, and the courage to address not just the symptoms of family dysfunction, but its underlying causes. As he prepared for the morning's proceedings, Judge Caprio reflected on the delicate balance he would need to strike. His primary concern was Emma's welfare, ensuring that she received the care, stability, and nurturing environment that every child deserved. But he also recognized that Derek was not a monster, but rather a man who had lost his way in the aftermath of profound grief and personal crisis. The challenge would be determining whether Derek possessed the capacity and motivation to transform himself into the father that Emma desperately needed. The courtroom began to fill with the various parties involved in the case. Derek Mitchell sat with his court-appointed attorney, his demeanor calm and confident. He had spent weeks preparing explanations for his actions, constructing a narrative that would minimize his responsibility while generating sympathy for his circumstances as a grieving widower. He believed that his articulate manner and apparent sincerity would persuade Judge Caprio to view his situation with understanding and leniency. Nearby sat Mrs. Santos and representatives from DCYF, their files, thick with documentation of Emma's neglect and their recommendations for her protection. These dedicated professionals had seen too many cases where parental dysfunction was excused or minimized, leaving children to suffer continued harm. They hoped that Judge Caprio would take decisive action to ensure Emma's safety and well-being. Most importantly, though not physically present in the courtroom, Emma's voice would be heard through the careful documentation of her experiences and needs. Judge Caprio had read her words, seen photographs of her living conditions, and reviewed expert assessments of her psychological and physical condition. Though she was too young to testify in person, her story would guide every aspect of his decision-making process. As the clock approached 9 a.m. and the bailiff prepared to announce Judge Caprio's entrance, the courtroom held an anticipatory tension. Everyone present understood that this was more than a routine hearing about truancy, fines. This was a moment when the justice system would either protect a vulnerable child or fail in one of its most sacred responsibilities. Judge Frank Caprio, with his legendary combination of legal expertise and human compassion, was about to demonstrate why some decisions require not just legal knowledge, but moral courage and unwavering commitment to those who cannot protect themselves. Derek Mitchell rose from his seat as his case was called, his movements calculated to project the image of a responsible, grieving father who had simply faced overwhelming circumstances. He had dressed carefully for this appearance, a conservative navy suit that suggested stability, a muted tie that conveyed respect for the court, and polished shoes that demonstrated attention to detail. Every aspect of his presentation had been designed to support the narrative he intended to present to Judge Caprio. Derek's strategy was sophisticated in its manipulation of sympathy and deflection of responsibility. He had spent weeks crafting explanations that would transform his neglect of Emma into understandable responses to grief and hardship. In his mind, he wasn't a father who had abandoned his daughter's needs. He was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, doing his best to cope with impossible challenges while working to support his family financially. The performance began immediately as Derek took the witness stand. His voice carried the perfect modulation of respectful sorrow as he began recounting his version of events. According to Derek, the truancy issues had resulted from a series of unfortunate miscommunications and temporary difficulties rather than systematic neglect. He explained that his work schedule as a maintenance supervisor often required emergency calls during school hours, making it difficult to maintain perfect attendance records. He suggested that the school's communication system was inadequate, claiming he had never received proper notification of Emma's absences. Derek's account of Emma's living conditions was masterfully reframed to minimize his responsibility while generating sympathy for his situation. The unwashed clothes and poor hygiene weren't evidence of neglect, but rather the natural challenges faced by a single father learning to manage household responsibilities that had previously been handled by his late wife. The lack of food in the refrigerator wasn't due to his gaming addiction consuming his attention, but rather his dedication to working overtime to ensure financial security for Emma's future. Most insidiously, Derek began to subtly blame Emma herself for some of the difficulties. He portrayed her as a strong-willed child who resisted his authority and preferred to handle things independently. Her attempts to wake herself up for school weren't desperate adaptations to his negligence, but evidence of her stubborn refusal to accept his help. Her withdrawal and sadness weren't responses to emotional neglect, but rather natural grief reactions that he claimed to be addressing through patience and understanding. Judge Caprio listened to Derek's testimony with the careful attention that characterized his approach to every case, but his experienced eyes were detecting inconsistencies and manipulations that Derek believed were invisible. The judge had spent 4 decades learning to distinguish between genuine remorse and calculated performance, between honest explanation and self-serving justification. Derek's polished presentation was actually working against him, as it revealed a level of preparation and strategic thinking that contradicted his claims of being overwhelmed by circumstances. Derek's explanation of his gaming activities demonstrated the depth of his self-deception and his willingness to distort reality to avoid responsibility. He acknowledged spending time online, but characterized it as necessary stress, relief, and social connection during his period of mourning. He claimed that his late-night gaming sessions were actually beneficial to Emma, as they allowed him to decompress from work stress and be more emotionally available during their time together. He conveniently omitted the fact that these sessions lasted 6 to 8 hours nightly and completely prevented him from fulfilling basic parental responsibilities. The most disturbing aspect of Derek's testimony was his complete lack of insight into Emma's experience and emotional needs. When asked about his daughter's well-being, he described her as resilient and independent, terms that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of child development and his failure to recognize that her apparent self-sufficiency was actually a trauma response to inadequate care. He seemed proud of her independence rather than concerned about its underlying causes. Derek's portrayal of his relationship with Emma was particularly manipulative in its selective presentation of facts. He spoke warmly about occasional activities they shared, watching movies together, going to the park, or ordering takeout, without acknowledging that these sporadic interactions occurred against a backdrop of daily emotional neglect. He presented these minimal efforts as evidence of his dedication as a father, while completely ignoring the countless hours Emma spent alone, unsupervised, and emotionally abandoned. When pressed about specific incidents documented by school officials and DCYF investigators, Derek's responses revealed his sophisticated ability to rationalize and minimize his failures. Emma's appearance at school in dirty clothes wasn't due to his neglect of laundry, but rather her preference for certain outfits and his respect for her growing autonomy. Her hoarding of food wasn't a response to inconsistent meals at home, but rather normal childhood behavior that he was monitoring appropriately. Judge Caprio's questions became increasingly pointed as Derek's testimony continued, though the judge maintained his characteristic gentle demeanor even as he probed for truth behind the carefully constructed facades. The judge's inquiries revealed his deep understanding of both family dynamics and child psychology, as he asked questions that exposed the gaps between Derek's claims and the documented reality of Emma's experience. Derek's responses to Judge Caprio's probing questions began to reveal cracks in his composed presentation. When asked about specific instances of Emma's distress documented by school officials, Derek's explanations became more convoluted and less believable. When questioned about his knowledge of basic child development and age-appropriate expectations, his responses demonstrated a profound ignorance of his daughter's emotional and psychological needs. The turning point in Derek's testimony came when Judge Caprio asked him to describe a typical day in Emma's life from her perspective. Derek's response revealed the complete extent of his detachment from his daughter's experience. He described a routine that bore no resemblance to the reality documented by investigators, a fantasy version of family life that existed only in his own mind. His account portrayed Emma as happy and well cared for, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Judge Caprio's follow-up questions systematically dismantled Derek's false narrative by presenting specific evidence of Emma's neglect. School photographs showing her deteriorating appearance over time, documentation of missed medical appointments, records of her academic decline, and testimony from neighbors about her solitary behavior all contradicted Derek's portrayal of adequate parenting. With each piece of evidence, Derek's explanations became more desperate and less credible. Derek's reaction to this mounting evidence revealed the true nature of his character. Rather than acknowledging his failures and expressing genuine remorse, he became defensive and began shifting blame to others. He criticized the school for being overly intrusive, questioned the competence of DCYF investigators, and suggested that his late wife had spoiled Emma, making normal parenting more difficult. These responses demonstrated his fundamental inability to accept responsibility for his daughter's suffering. Perhaps most revealing was Derek's complete failure to express genuine concern for Emma's emotional well-being. Throughout his lengthy testimony, he never acknowledged her pain, never recognized her courage in trying to cope with his neglect, and never expressed real remorse for the harm he had caused. His focus remained entirely on justifying his own actions and generating sympathy for his circumstances, revealing a level of narcissism that made meaningful change seem unlikely. Judge Caprio's expression during Derek's testimony underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The gentle, patient demeanor that had characterized the beginning of the session gradually gave way to something more serious. Not anger, which was foreign to Judge Caprio's nature, but rather a profound disappointment and growing determination to protect Emma from further harm. The judge's questions became more direct, his tone more pointed, as he recognized that Derek's testimony was not an honest accounting of his failures, but rather a calculated attempt to avoid consequences. The contrast between Derek's polished self-justifications and the documented reality of Emma's neglect created a stark illustration of the gap between appearance and truth. Derek's ability to speak eloquently about his challenges and intentions only highlighted his complete failure to translate those supposed good intentions into actual care for his daughter. His sophisticated explanations served to demonstrate not his victimization by circumstances, but rather his calculated indifference to Emma's suffering. As Derek's testimony drew to a close, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a routine hearing about truancy violations had become something much more significant, an examination of fundamental questions about parental responsibility, child welfare, and the obligation of adults to prioritize children's needs over their own comfort and convenience. Derek concluded his testimony with a final appeal for understanding and leniency, asking Judge Caprio to consider his grief, his financial pressures, and his commitment to improving as a father. But his words rang hollow in the context of the evidence that had been presented. His request for another chance seemed less like genuine repentance and more like a strategy to avoid consequences while continuing the patterns of behavior that had already caused Emma so much harm. Judge Caprio sat in thoughtful silence as Derek returned to his seat, the judge's mind processing not just the legal implications of the case, but its profound moral dimensions. The beloved judge understood that his decision would determine not just Derek's legal consequences, but Emma's entire future. The weight of that responsibility, combined with his deep compassion for children and his unwavering commitment to justice, was preparing him to deliver one of the most powerful and decisive rulings of his distinguished career. Judge Frank Caprio sat motionless at his bench for several moments after Derek Mitchell concluded his testimony, the silence in the courtroom so profound that the only sound was the gentle hum of the heating system and the distant traffic from downtown Providence. Those who knew the judge well recognized this contemplative pause as the moment when his legendary wisdom and compassion crystallized into the moral clarity that would guide his decision. For Judge Caprio, this case represented far more than a legal proceeding. It was a sacred trust to protect a vulnerable child whose voice deserved to be heard and whose needs demanded immediate, decisive action. The judge's weathered hands, which had signed thousands of orders over his 4 decades on the bench, now held Emma Mitchell's file with particular reverence. Inside these manila folders was the documented story of an 8-year-old girl whose childhood had been stolen by the very person sworn to protect her. Judge Caprio had read every page, studied every photograph, and absorbed every detail of Emma's experience, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that justice for children required not just legal expertise, but profound moral courage. As Judge Caprio began to speak, his voice carried the gentle authority that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island and beyond. But those familiar with his judicial style could detect a new undertone, not anger, which was foreign to his compassionate nature, but rather an unwavering resolve that signaled his complete commitment to Emma's welfare above all other considerations. The judge's analysis began with a careful examination of the evidence that painted the true picture of Emma's daily life. He methodically reviewed the school records that documented her transformation from a bright, engaged student into a withdrawn child struggling to cope with circumstances far beyond her understanding. He described the photographs that showed her deteriorating appearance, the documentation of missed medical appointments, and the reports of neighbors who had witnessed a little girl forced to navigate adult responsibilities alone. Judge Caprio's recounting of the evidence was not delivered with theatrical dramatics, but rather with the quiet intensity of someone determined to ensure that truth would not be obscured by manipulation or self-serving explanations. Each fact was presented clearly and directly, building an undeniable picture of systematic neglect that no amount of eloquent justification could minimize or explain away. The judge's legal analysis demonstrated his masterful understanding of both child welfare law and the broader principles that governed parental responsibility. He explained how Derek's actions violated not just specific statutes regarding school attendance and basic care, but also the fundamental legal and moral obligations that society placed on parents to prioritize their children's needs above their own desires and convenience. But Judge Caprio's most powerful statements address the psychological and emotional dimensions of Emma's neglect. Drawing upon his deep understanding of child development and his own experience as a father and grandfather, he explained how Derek's emotional withdrawal and systematic inattention had inflicted trauma that would affect Emma for years to come. The judge described how children Emma's age required not just physical care, but emotional security, consistent attention, and the assurance that they were valued and cherished by the adults responsible for their welfare. Judge Caprio's voice carried particular weight as he addressed Derek's attempts to portray Emma's independence as evidence of her resilience and his adequate parenting. With gentle but unmistakable authority, the judge explained how Emma's apparent self-sufficiency was actually a trauma response, the desperate adaptation of a child forced to meet her own needs when the adults in her life failed to provide appropriate care and guidance. Her ability to wake herself up for school, prepare her own meals, and manage without parental involvement weren't signs of strength, but rather heartbreaking evidence of abandonment. The judge's analysis of Derek's testimony revealed his sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and self-deception. Without raising his voice or using inflammatory language, Judge Caprio systematically dismantled each of Derek's justifications, exposing them as elaborate rationalizations designed to avoid responsibility rather than honest admissions of failure. The judge's approach was surgical in its precision. Each false claim was addressed with documented evidence. Each excuse was countered with irrefutable facts. Judge Caprio's discussion of Derek's gaming addiction demonstrated the judge's deep understanding of how personal struggles could affect family dynamics, but also his unwavering insistence that adult difficulties could never justify the neglect of children's fundamental needs. The judge acknowledged Derek's grief over his wife's death with genuine compassion, but firmly established that mourning could not serve as an excuse for abandoning parental responsibilities that Emma had no choice but to depend upon. The judge's most powerful statements addressed Derek's complete failure to demonstrate genuine understanding of Emma's experience or authentic remorse for the harm he had caused. Judge Caprio observed that throughout his lengthy testimony, Derek had focused entirely on justifying his own actions and generating sympathy for his circumstances, while showing no meaningful concern for his daughter's emotional suffering or developmental needs. This self-centered approach to parenting revealed a fundamental character flaw that made supervised intervention necessary to protect Emma's welfare. Judge Caprio's examination of the case extended beyond the immediate legal issues to address broader questions about society's obligation to protect vulnerable children from adult dysfunction. The judge explained how cases like Emma's tested the justice system's commitment to prioritizing children's needs over adult convenience, and how courts had both the legal authority and moral responsibility to intervene when parents failed to meet basic standards of care. The judge's analysis also addressed the long-term implications of Emma's neglect, drawing upon research about childhood trauma and its effects on development, education, and future relationships. Judge Caprio explained how early experiences of neglect created lasting vulnerabilities that required not just immediate intervention, but ongoing support and therapeutic assistance to help children heal from the wounds inflicted by inadequate care. As Judge Caprio's analysis continued, the courtroom atmosphere became increasingly tense as everyone present recognized that the judge was building toward a decisive and comprehensive ruling. Derek Mitchell's confident demeanor had gradually evaporated as the judge's methodical dismantling of his justifications revealed the complete inadequacy of his defense. The attorneys present recognized that they were witnessing judicial wisdom and moral courage of the highest order. Judge Caprio's discussion of Emma's future needs demonstrated his deep understanding of child welfare principles and his commitment to ensuring that his ruling would provide her with the stability, safety, and nurturing environment she deserved. The judge explained how Emma's case required not just immediate protection from further neglect, but also comprehensive services to address the trauma she had already experienced and support her healthy development going forward. The judge's analysis of Derek's potential for rehabilitation was perhaps the most devastating aspect of his examination. While maintaining his characteristic compassion for humans struggling, Judge Caprio observed that Derek's testimony had revealed a profound inability to acknowledge his failures, understand Emma's needs, or demonstrate genuine commitment to change. The judge explained how meaningful rehabilitation required not just promises of improvement, but evidence of insight, remorse, and concrete behavioral changes that Derek had thus far failed to demonstrate. Judge Caprio's preliminary conclusions began to crystallize as he reviewed the fundamental questions that the case presented. Had Derek Mitchell demonstrated the capacity to provide Emma with the consistent, nurturing care that every child deserved? Had he shown genuine understanding of the harm his neglect had caused? Had he presented credible evidence of his commitment to prioritizing Emma's needs above his own comfort and convenience? The judge's careful analysis made clear that the answer to each of these crucial questions was unequivocally negative. As Judge Caprio prepared to deliver his final ruling, the courtroom held an anticipatory silence that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of the moment. Everyone present understood that this decision would determine not just the immediate legal consequences for Derek Mitchell, but the entire trajectory of Emma's childhood and future development. The judge's legendary reputation for combining legal expertise with profound human compassion had prepared those present for a ruling that would be both decisive and transformative. Judge Caprio's final preparation for his ruling involved a moment of quiet reflection that seemed to draw upon not just his legal knowledge, but his deepest understanding of justice, morality, and the sacred responsibility that adults bore toward the children in their care. As he prepared to speak, his expression conveyed both the weight of his decision and his complete confidence that his ruling would serve Emma's best interests while holding Derek accountable for his failures as a parent. The courtroom waited in respectful silence as Judge Frank Caprio prepared to deliver a ruling that would demonstrate why his combination of legal wisdom and moral courage had made him a beacon of hope for families throughout Rhode Island and beyond. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as Judge Caprio's ruling progressed. Derek's attorney shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that his client's defense had not only failed, but had actually strengthened the case for decisive judicial intervention. The representatives from DCYF sat forward in their chairs, understanding that they were witnessing a ruling that would provide Emma with the protection and support she needed while holding Derek fully accountable for his failures. Judge Caprio's discussion of Emma's emotional and psychological needs revealed his deep understanding of child development and the lasting impact of early neglect. Emma is not the independent and resilient child you described in your testimony, Mr. Mitchell. She is a traumatized 8-year-old who has been forced to develop survival strategies that no child should ever need. Her apparent self-sufficiency is not evidence of your adequate parenting. It is heartbreaking proof of your abandonment. The judge's voice carried particular power as he addressed Derek's complete failure to understand Emma's experience. Throughout your testimony, you have portrayed Emma's desperate adaptations to your neglect as positive character traits. You have described her attempts to manage adult responsibilities as evidence of her strength rather than your failure. This fundamental misunderstanding of your daughter's needs demonstrates that you lack the insight necessary to provide appropriate parental care. Judge Caprio's legal analysis was comprehensive and unambiguous. He cited specific statutes regarding educational neglect, child welfare requirements, and parental obligations, while connecting these legal principles to their real-world impact on Emma's development and well-being. The judge explained how Derek's actions violated not just technical regulations, but fundamental societal expectations about adult responsibility toward children. The judge's most powerful statements addressed the broader moral dimensions of the case. Parenthood, Mr. Mitchell, is not a part-time responsibility that can be set aside when it becomes inconvenient or challenging. It is a sacred trust that requires adults to consistently prioritize their children's needs above their own desires and comfort. You have violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible, by abandoning Emma emotionally and practically, while expecting her to adapt to your inadequacy, rather than demanding that you rise to meet your obligations. Judge Caprio's ruling began with immediate protective measures designed to ensure Emma's safety and well-being. He ordered Derek's parental rights to be suspended pending successful completion of comprehensive parenting education, psychological evaluation, and addiction counseling, specifically addressing his gaming dependency. The judge made clear that any future contact with Emma would require supervised visitation until Derek demonstrated genuine understanding of his failures and credible commitment to change. But Judge Caprio's most significant decision involved Emma's placement and future. Rather than simply removing her from Derek's custody, the judge ordered a comprehensive assessment of her extended family network to identify relatives who could provide the stable, nurturing environment she needed. He mandated trauma-informed counseling to help Emma process the emotional wounds caused by her father's neglect, and educational support to address the academic deficits created by her irregular school attendance. The judge's ruling also addressed Derek's financial obligations toward Emma's care, ordering him to provide full support for her placement, counseling, and any additional services required to address the harm caused by his neglect. Judge Caprio made clear that Derek's financial responsibility would continue regardless of his custodial status, ensuring that Emma's needs would be met while her father worked toward potential rehabilitation. Judge Caprio's final words to Derek Mitchell were delivered with the moral authority that had defined his distinguished career. Mr. Mitchell, you have failed Emma in every fundamental way that a parent can fail a child. Your neglect has stolen her sense of security, damaged her trust in adult care, and forced her to navigate challenges that she was too young to handle alone. The harm you have caused will require years of healing and support to address. The judge's voice grew stronger as he concluded his direct address to Derek. However, I want you to understand that this ruling is not about punishment. It is about protection. Emma deserves a childhood filled with consistent care, emotional support, and the unwavering love that every child has the right to expect from their parents. You have proven that you are currently incapable of providing those essential elements of childhood, and therefore the state has both the authority and the obligation to ensure that she receives them from others. Judge Caprio's expression softened slightly as he addressed the possibility of Derek's rehabilitation, demonstrating the compassion that had defined his judicial philosophy throughout his career. If you are genuinely committed to becoming the father Emma needs and deserves, then you must begin by acknowledging the full extent of the harm you have caused. You must complete every requirement I have ordered, demonstrate sustained behavioral change over time, and prove through consistent actions, not words, that you can prioritize Emma's needs above your own convenience. The judge's voice carried both hope and skepticism as he explained the conditions under which Derek might potentially regain any parental rights. Rehabilitation is possible, Mr. Mitchell, but it requires authentic transformation of character, not merely compliance with court orders. It demands that you develop genuine empathy for Emma's experience, real understanding of child development, and sustained commitment to putting her welfare first in every decision you make. Judge Caprio turned his attention to the broader implications of the case, addressing the courtroom with the wisdom that had made him a respected voice on family law and child welfare throughout New England. This case serves as a stark reminder that children cannot advocate for themselves when the adults responsible for their care fail in their duties. They cannot seek other housing when their basic needs are unmet, cannot hire attorneys when their rights are violated, and cannot escape situations that damage their development and well-being. The judge's voice resonated with moral authority as he explained society's obligation to protect vulnerable children. When parents fail to meet their fundamental responsibilities, our justice system must step forward to provide the protection that children cannot secure for themselves. This is not government overreach. This is the fulfillment of our most sacred obligation as a civilized society. Judge Caprio's attention then turned to Emma herself, though she was not present in the courtroom. His voice carried profound tenderness as he addressed her situation directly. Emma Mitchell is an 8-year-old girl who has demonstrated remarkable courage and resilience in circumstances that no child should ever face. She has tried to maintain her education despite lack of support, attempted to care for herself when her father abdicated his responsibilities, and preserved her capacity for hope despite experiencing systematic neglect. The judge's description of Emma's future care demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of trauma-informed approaches to child welfare. He ordered not just immediate safety measures, but long-term therapeutic support designed to help her heal from the emotional wounds caused by her father's neglect. The placement with extended family members would be carefully monitored to ensure that Emma received not just adequate care, but the nurturing environment necessary for healthy development. Judge Caprio's ruling also addressed the systemic issues revealed by Emma's case. He ordered a review of school protocols for identifying and responding to signs of neglect, enhanced training for educational staff on recognizing trauma symptoms in children, and improved coordination between schools, social services, and the court system to ensure that vulnerable children receive timely intervention. The judge's discussion of preventive measures demonstrated his commitment to protecting other children from similar experiences. He mandated community education programs about parental responsibilities, resources for families facing crisis situations, and support services for single parents struggling with grief, addiction, or other challenges that might affect their caregiving capacity. As Judge Caprio's comprehensive ruling drew toward its conclusion, the courtroom remained in absolute silence, everyone present understanding that they had witnessed judicial wisdom and moral courage of the highest order. The judge's decision addressed not just the immediate legal issues, but the fundamental questions about adult responsibility, child welfare, and society's obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. Derek Mitchell sat in stunned silence, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the elaborate self-justifications that had allowed him to rationalize his neglect of Emma. His confident demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning recognition that his failures as a father had real, serious consequences that no amount of eloquent explanation could minimize or avoid. Judge Caprio's final words to the court carried the weight of his entire distinguished career and his unwavering commitment to justice balanced with compassion. The law exists not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves, and to uphold the values that make our society worthy of preservation. Today's ruling affirms that children have rights that adults must respect, needs that adults must meet, and a dignity that no adult has the right to compromise through neglect or abandonment. The judge's voice grew stronger as he delivered his concluding statement. Emma Mitchell's childhood cannot be restored, but her future can be secured. The harm that has been done to her will require time, care, and professional support to heal. But with appropriate intervention and a stable, nurturing environment, she can overcome the trauma she has experienced and develop into the remarkable young woman that her intelligence, courage, and resilience suggest she has the potential to become. Judge Caprio's final directive to Derek was delivered with quiet intensity that made it more powerful than any dramatic pronouncement. Mr. Mitchell, you have been given an opportunity, perhaps your last opportunity, to transform yourself into the father that Emma deserves. Whether you take advantage of that opportunity or continue down the path of self-justification and avoidance will determine not just your own future, but whether you will ever again have the privilege of being part of Emma's life. As Judge Caprio concluded his ruling and prepared to adjourn the courtroom remained in respectful silence, everyone present understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary, a perfect demonstration of how justice could be both firm and compassionate, how legal authority could be wielded with wisdom and moral clarity, and how the protection of vulnerable children required not just technical compliance with statutes, but profound commitment to the values that those laws were designed to serve. The representatives from DCYF approached the bench to discuss the immediate implementation of Judge Caprio's orders, their faces reflecting both relief that Emma would receive the protection she needed and admiration for the comprehensive nature of the judge's ruling. They understood that this case would serve as a model for how the justice system could effectively respond to child neglect while maintaining appropriate balance between family preservation and child protection. Derek Mitchell's attorney struggled to console his client, who had finally begun to understand the magnitude of his failures and their consequences. The elaborate defense strategy that had seemed so persuasive in preparation had crumbled completely under Judge Caprio's careful examination, leaving Derek to confront the reality of his inadequacy as a parent and the harm he had caused to his daughter. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Judge Caprio remained at his bench for several minutes, reviewing his orders and ensuring that every detail had been addressed to provide Emma with the comprehensive protection and support she needed. His thoughts turned to his own grandchildren, safely tucked into their beds each night by parents who understood and fulfilled their sacred obligations, and he felt profound satisfaction that his ruling would help ensure Emma could eventually experience that same security and love. The case of State of Rhode Island versus Derek Mitchell became more than a legal precedent. It became a testament to the power of judicial wisdom combined with moral courage, a demonstration of how the justice system could effectively protect vulnerable children while maintaining appropriate balance between accountability and the possibility of redemption. Judge Frank Caprio's handling of the case added another chapter to his legendary reputation as a jurist who combined legal expertise with profound human compassion, always remembering that behind every case file was a real person whose life would be affected by his decisions. Emma Mitchell's future while scarred by the early trauma of neglect, was now secure in the hands of extended family members who understood their responsibilities and were committed to providing the love, stability, and nurturing care that every child deserved. With appropriate therapeutic support and a stable environment, she would have the opportunity to heal from her wounds and develop into the remarkable person that her courage and resilience had already shown her to be. Derek Mitchell faced a long journey toward potential rehabilitation, one that would require him to confront fundamental character flaws and develop genuine empathy and understanding that he had thus far failed to demonstrate. Whether he would take advantage of this final opportunity for transformation remained to be seen, but Judge Caprio's ruling ensured that Emma's welfare would not depend on her father's uncertain capacity for change. In Providence Municipal Court, Courtroom 2A, justice had been served with both strength and compassion, demonstrating once again why Judge Frank Caprio's decisions were admired not just for their legal wisdom, but for their unwavering commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves and upholding the values that made their community worth preserving. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.